Chapter 31 of Resurrections, Part 3.
We did it!
Twilight said breathlessly. Looking behind her, she could see a distant border where the lake water turned into starlight, drifting up into an infinite curtain of stars.
We made it to the center! Finally!
Midnight looked up, focusing on something above them.
Now we can do what we came here to do.
Arcing through the split sky, two silhouettes battled for dominance. Luna's guardian could barely be seen until it flew under the angry red clouds that dominated half the horizon, its astral form silhouetted clearly against them. It twisted its head, firing a beam of starlight from the tip of its long horn. Opposite it, Luna's weird lifted one of its blood-stained wings, erecting a thick red shield that absorbed the beam and then shattered, splitting into 1,000 drops of blood that rained down into the waters below.
Right.
Twilight nodded, spreading her stance.
So here's the plan.
Midnight spread her stance and roared as she launched a lance of lavender magic towards the weird, the water rippling and splashing around her hooves. The weird stiffened, disappearing in a flash of red just as the attack cut through the sky where it had been. It popped back into being a short distance away, baring its fangs and hissing in fury.
Midnight!
Twilight stomped a hoof.
That is not a plan! You make the plan!
Midnight's lips peeled back as she answered the weird with her own equally bloody snarl.
I will kill the monster!
She ran forwards, hooves kicking up fountains of water in her wake and horn glowing lavender with crackling arcs of red lightning. She pulled 2 jets of water from the lake as she ran, draining their heat until they formed into a pair of misshapen spears, and threw them ahead of her, each one leaving a hanging mist of vapor in their wake. The weird jerked its head, lifting a curtain of blood from the lake in front of it. The curtain hardened into a firm wall, intercepting the ice spears, and a second later burst apart as the weird leapt through it, meeting Midnight head-on. Twilight flinched as Midnight and the weird locked horns, snarling and stomping like crazed animals. Even watching from a distance, her connection to Midnight let her experience a shadow of the battle, as if she were in it herself. She could feel the muscles in her neck straining, the excited shriek of magic as she twisted her horn to try and hit her enemy with bolts of magic, the water splashing around her hooves as she fought to keep her balance while dislodging her foe, and most breathtaking of all, the pure hatred welling in her breast, so powerful it threatened to swallow all conscious thought. Twilight stumbled and shook her head, looking away and withdrawing from her connection with Midnight. She ran towards Luna instead, the water kicked up by her hooves tickling at her belly.
Princess!
She called, eyes fixed on Luna's sleeping form. She grinned as she reached the small island in the center of the lake and climbed up the sandy beach, just a few steps away from the cushion the princess reclined on. She looked utterly at peace here, without the bloody tears that were stained into her cheeks in the waking world. A sudden wave of force shoved Twilight back into the lake. She yelped, falling on her back, and looking up at the astral guardian that floated down to stand in front of her, blocking her path.
Wait! It's okay!
Twilight climbed carefully back to her hooves, looking to where she imagined the eyes would be on the guardian's featureless head.
I'm on your side!
The guardian did not move. After a few seconds, its head twisted slightly.
You have to recognize me!
Twilight tried, a note of uncertainty creeping into her voice.
I'm Twilight Sparkle! My friends and I rescued Princess Luna from Nightmare Moon. Please, let me help her!
The guardian did not move.
You're part of her subconscious, right?
Twilight walked to the side, trying to get a glimpse at Luna. The guardian remained perfectly still, but somehow remained directly in front of her, blocking her view of the princess.
Don't you recognize me?
The guardian showed no reaction. Twilight grimaced, plopping back down onto her haunches. Was she doing something wrong? She racked her memory of the dreamwalking lessons Luna had given her, but this was so far beyond the basic principle she'd been taught, she couldn't even guess at what she might need to do. She bit her lip, frustration welling in her chest and coming out in an angry stomp.
Let me through!
The Guardian lowered its stance, answering her with a wispy, warning hiss. A sharp cry of pain from Midnight drew Twilight's attention. She whirled, watching as the other mare was sent tumbling across the lake, trailing blood. Luna's weird raced after her, its maw wide open to reveal several rows of deadly fangs, poised to strike.
No!
Twilight gasped, horns sparking to life. Without thinking, she teleported to Midnight's side, summoning a spherical shield around them just in time to intercept the weird's descending fangs.
What are you doing?
Midnight growled, wincing as she rolled onto her belly.
I do not need your help, little flower!
Twilight grunted, transferring the energy from her shield into a shockwave that sent the weird stumbling backwards. She grabbed Midnight's shoulder and helped her back to her hooves.
We're doing this together, right?
Midnight opened her mouth, and Twilight could see the scathing retort forming in her mind. But instead, she hesitated, briefly meeting Twilight's eyes, and then looking away.
Together, yes. It won't stand a chance. Great.
Twilight smiled.
I'll focus on defense. You do what you do best.
Midnight snorted, rolling her shoulders.
You would be a pitifully poor attacker.
Luna's weird drew their attention with a raspy snarl. It squared off against the two of them, its tail lashing sharply behind it, and its horn dripping a thick stream of blood. Now that she was closer, Twilight was struck by the tangible hunger in its eyes. Under all of the scars and blood, it was still a perfect replica of Princess Luna, and she found herself wondering if this was what Midnight would have become if Twilight hadn't tried showing her another way. Midnight struck first, swinging her head down and launching an arc of crackling lavender energy that screeched through the air like a saw blade, throwing up a curtain of glittering water behind it. The weird deflected the attack with an explosive burst of red magic, then rushed in, long talons extending from its hooves as it pounced. Twilight clenched her jaw and erected a shield, throwing the monster back. The fight quickly fell into a rhythm. Midnight unleashed a ceaseless assault, attacking from every direction with bolts of magic, sharpened spikes of ice, jabs from her horn, and bucks of her hind legs. But none of her attacks made a solid connection. Twilight could barely keep up with her, putting all of her focus on deflecting the weird's own attacks, flinching back as it shrieked and wailed its hate. They were locked in stalemate, neither side able to hurt the other. But Twilight could feel her reactions slowing, and Midnight's too. No matter how determined they might be, Luna was still the Princess of Dreams, and her weird showed no sign of tiring. Twilight's shields went from all protecting domes to small flickering discs that existed just long enough to block one strike before dissipating, and soon they began to crack and chip as they were struck. Despite her fury, Midnight's attacks were growing weaker, her challenging roars less common, and all the while Twilight caught glimpses of the Guardian standing in the background, watching impassively. Finally, a blow made it through. Twilight cried out as she was thrown to the side, bouncing and skipping across the lake before rolling to a stop. She groaned, blinking the stars from her eyes as her ears rang. Glancing to her left, she saw the edge of the lake dissolving into starlight. To her right, she saw Midnight dodge 2 lunges from the weird's wings, then catch a blast of magic that knocked her onto her back with a sharp yelp. The weird stomped its hooves and flared its wings, roaring a challenge as Twilight struggled to a sitting position. She wasn't bleeding, she wasn't even bruised. But she could feel the impact of the weird's attacks in a persistent, painful throbbing at the base of her horn. Dream or not, if it hit her hard enough, she would be helpless, and it wouldn't hesitate to consume her consciousness just like all of its past victims. Midnight rolled back to her hooves with a frustrated scream, stomping and kicking at the water around her. Twilight let out a quiet grunt before teleporting to her side and laying a consoling hoof on her shoulder.
Midnight, calm down,
she said.
Getting mad doesn't help anything. Mad?
Midnight echoed haggardly, shaking her head.
How can you not be mad? This mindless creature is beating us, even when we work together.
She jerked her head towards the posturing weird, lips pulled back into a snarl.
Don't you realize what happens if we lose here?
Twilight flinched.
Well, we will die, Twilight!
Midnight snapped.
We will stop breathing on the floor of Shaper's throne room, another victim of hundreds! Our friends will never know what happened. We will fail!
Twilight blinked, stunned by the emotion in Midnight's voice.
What?
Midnight spat.
You know I'm right. You feel it too. Or you would, if you didn't push it all onto me.
Twilight frowned, taken aback by the accusation.
I don't. You are!
Midnight turned towards the weird and spread her stance, tail lashing behind her and blood tears welling in her eyes.
You think you're calm right now because you're good at handling stress? You bottle it all up and hide it away, like always, little flower. But that's fine.
Midnight's horn began to glow, the wine of magic building around them.
I'll take it. I hold the pain, and you do the thinking. That's how we work best.
An arcane wind circled around them, tugging at their manes and sending ripples through the water as Midnight pulled more and more magic into her horn. Twilight watched in silence, seeing the mess of emotions and the heaving of Midnight's chest, the stains on her cheeks, the twitching of her ears and the clench of her jaw. And she realized. Twilight reached out, taking Midnight's hoof with her own. The other mare looked down in confusion, going to pull it away, but before she could move, Twilight closed her eyes and allowed herself to feel. All the pain, the shame, the terrible, breathtaking dread of what might happen, squeezed into a tight knot by the pressure of expectation. The white-hot rage with nothing to take it out on, an inferno inside her that made her want to scream and stomp until she collapsed from exhaustion. The tentative hope lingering under it all, wrapped protectively around the love she had for her friends. All the little feelings she had pushed aside for later, pressed down and packaged into neat items on a checklist that she could ignore as long as she kept moving forward. It was there for just an instant before Midnight yanked her hoof away, taking the flood of emotion back with it. Twilight gasped, opening her eyes and gazing intently into Midnight's glare.
This is how you feel?
She whispered.
All the time? It's what you gave me. Look out!
Midnight pushed her back just as a thick tendril of blood lashed down in the space they'd been standing, throwing a curtain of water up between them.
It's my duty! That's how you see yourself?
Twilight leaned to the side, trying to catch Midnight's eye through the falling water.
But that's terrible! You misunderstand as always, little flower.
Midnight kept her gaze focused on Twilight, sidestepping a wild lunge of the weird's wing.
Yes, it is terrible!
Midnight grit her teeth and shoved the monster back with a blast of magic.
But I am not the victim!
Twilight stepped forwards, pausing as she tried to gather her thoughts, only for the weird to lash out with its other wing and catch her square in the chest. The blow drove the air from her lungs, lifting her off her hooves and sending her roaring backwards. Twilight struck the ground with a strangled yelp, bouncing and rolling before finally coming to a stop with her ears ringing. She blinked in shock, gasping for breath as she lifted her head, squinting into the blinding flash of light as the shriek of magic filled the air. Slowly, the image came into focus. Midnight was standing over her with a furious snarl, meeting a beam of energy from the weird with her own. The beams hissed and spat on contact before fizzling out with a deafening boom, sending Midnight stumbling back with a pained wince.
You see?
Midnight straightened up with a bloody grin, breathing hard.
I can take the pain. But...
Twilight climbed weakly to her hooves, muttering under her breath. All the pain she had pushed down, the hundreds of times she had set it aside for later. All this time, she'd only been putting it on Midnight?
I never meant to. Focus, little flower!
Midnight looked ahead and met the charging weird head-on, stabbing her horn into its chest and shoving it back with a roar of fury. Blood dripped from her horn as she yanked it free, scrambling away from a bite aimed for her throat.
I need you!
Twilight looked up, tears brimming in her eyes.
But I hurt you!
Midnight froze, turning to face Twilight.
What?
Twilight took a faltering step forwards, staring into Midnight's eyes.
It's my fault.
Midnight frowned, lifting a hoof with uncertainty. Behind her, the weird hissed, and a writhing tendril of blood burst from its side and smacked into the side of Midnight's head. She grunted as she was thrown to the ground, repelling the weird's follow-up with a shockwave of lavender energy.
This is not the time, Twilight!
Midnight leapt back to her hooves, dodging a blast from the weird's horn.
Now, of all times, you want to process these emotions?
Beads of water burst up around her, hardening into ice shards that she sent hurtling towards the weird, forcing it back.
Let me bear it for just a little longer! No.
Twilight's voice cracked. She wiped the tears from her eyes, summoning a shield in front of them just as the weird pounced with a deafening screech. The shield cracked as it impacted, but it did not break.
No more. This is not the time!
Midnight insisted, watching as the weird took flight and began to draw magic into its horn.
Do you want us to die? What you've dealt with?
Twilight reached out, taking one of Midnight's hooves firmly into her own.
That's not living.
As Midnight tried to pull away, Twilight closed her eyes and looked inwards, finding the barrier between them and forcing herself through it. Where before she had faced a flood of emotion, now it was an ocean. Twilight dove into it head first, pushing into the murky depths as the waves pushed her in every direction. The sea grabbed her like a riptide, pulling her down in competing currents of fury and fear, followed by a moment of panic. She realized that if she didn't turn back, then she would never escape, doomed to drown. But if she didn't keep going, then Midnight would have to face that fate alone, like she'd always done. Twilight surrendered herself to the darkness, breathing in deep. Cold, grasping claws pulled her down, whispering into her ears. She was ashamed of how she had treated her friends, and revolted by what she had become. She was afraid that after everything, she wouldn't be good enough, that she would fail. She hated her world for ending and leaving her behind. She hated Shaper, hated all the monsters that had forced her to fight. And most of all, she hated herself for selfishly forcing this pain on another. It was enough to overwhelm any pony, to turn them into a bitter, spitting villain that lashed out at any perceived threat. And as Twilight settled onto the seafloor, she saw Midnight standing across from her, her cheeks stained red, and her lips quivering beneath a shaky glare. There, at the bottom of it all, drowning in her turmoil, Twilight reached out, and for the first time since she had awoken in the dead ruins of Kennerlot, she stopped. Midnight's eyes widened, the blood trailing over her cheeks drying out. Crystal clear tears streamed down in their place, washing away the bloodstains.
Why are you doing this?
Twilight answered with a sad smile.
Because no one should have to endure that pain.
Her own tears thickened and darkened, turning to dark beads of blood dripping down her cheeks.
Least of all, a friend.
Midnight blinked.
It doesn't hurt.
She looked down at herself, her shoulders jerking as she let out a choked cry.
It always hurts. As long as I can remember.
Twilight stepped forward, pulling Midnight into a tight hug as the other mare began to sob in earnest. She wept too, her ears drooping as she let the months of suppressed grief finally wash over her. Midnight pulled her hooves up, returning the hug with a trembling squeeze. And despite everything, that made Twilight feel a little better. Even in the face of all her pain, fear, and doubts, she still had her friend with her. And friendship is magic. The light snapped back into vivid clarity around her as Twilight opened her eyes, blinking away the blood tears. She felt as if she had run 1,000 miles at a full sprint, and her head throbbed with a sharp, stabbing pain. Her hooves twitched, her breaths coming in little gasps as she was struck by a sudden, persistent urge to act, to do something, to do anything. Midnight stood at her side, a broad smile on her face. There was no bitterness, no judgment, no pain hidden behind a cocky mask.
I feel free.
The weird hovered over them, silhouetted by the blood moon in the sky. It reared back and unleashed a vivid lance of red magic aimed straight for them. Twilight went to summon a shield, but her magic faltered, the sparks fizzling out at the end of her horn. Midnight stepped forwards. Her horn burst to light as a radiant lavender dome formed around them. The weird's attack bounced off, crackling into smaller pieces that arced away and sent fountains of water splashing into the air where they landed.
I feel alive!
Midnight giggled, accompanied by the rippling of the water as she danced in place. Twilight flinched as cold drops of water splattered across her face. She opened her mouth to chastise Midnight for dancing in the middle of a fight to the death, only to bite her tongue at the last moment as she realized what she was doing. Swallowing the bile in her throat, she instead forced out a,
How? I've told you that you always held this power, little flower.
Midnight spread her stance and dispelled the shield, drawing more magic onto the tip of her horn as waves of light rippled and danced around them.
You've just been afraid to use it.
Aiming her horn at the weird hovering above them, Midnight unleashed a wave of searing white magic so bright that Twilight had to screw her eyes shut. Even though her eyelids, she saw the beam twist around itself as it cut through the air with an arcane shriek and a thunderous boom. There was a pained screech that echoed around them, followed by a heavy splash, and then a fading whine as the magic dissipated, leaving Twilight blinking the afterimage of the beam away and trying to shake the ringing out of her ears. It took her a moment to spot the weird, lying on its side a few yards away, completely still. Misty red arcs of blood swirled out into the lake around it, mixing with its blood-soaked mane and tail. Twilight waited. It didn't get up.
We did it!
Midnight stomped a hoof in celebration.
Ha! Did you see that?
Twilight could feel the surge of elation through their bond, but it was strangled by the fury still writhing in her gut. Nevertheless, she forced a smile onto her face and nodded.
Yeah, it was good.
Whatever she was going to say next was cut off by a strangled yelp as Midnight pulled her into a hug, squeezing her tightly.
Yeah, all right, that's enough.
Twilight tried to push her off, grumbling as her lips twitched up in a small smile despite herself.
Let me go! Ah.
Midnight gave Twilight one last squeeze before releasing her, running up to Luna's weird and sitting at its side. Twilight followed at a cautious walk, scanning the lake for any other threats. It was easy to imagine the weird was dead, but Twilight suspected it would recover within a day, maybe less. She glanced toward the island, where the Guardian was still watching in silence by Luna's sleeping form, and narrowed her eyes. Now that the weird was beaten, the Guardian was the next biggest threat. The Guardian stared back impassively, as if it were mocking her.
Come on,
Midnight said, drawing her attention.
It's time to wake up.
Twilight nodded, positioning herself above the weird's head. Lowering her horn until it touched against the jagged tip of the weird's, Twilight closed her eyes. Twilight woke up with her chin resting on Luna's barrel. The cold crystal of the floor had grown warm against her body, its surface tinted by the soft lavender glow of the shield surrounding her. She was exhausted. A bone-deep weariness that she felt in every muscle, every breath, and every beat of her heart. Her heart ached as if it were about to burst, and her legs shuddered with the effort of standing. She could barely think, and she wondered at how Midnight had functioned at all.
Equestrian.
Shaper's deep voice sounded like distant thunder at first, muffled by the horizon.
It is done.
Twilight teetered for a moment, taking a breath as she tried to gather her thoughts. Midnight appeared at her side, placing a comforting hoof against her shoulder.
It's done.
Yes, we feel it now. Our magic knotted together with hers.
Shaper let out a long, low hum.
And something else, too.
Twilight tensed, her magic responding sluggishly as she prepared a spell.
You are lighter, altered.
The shadows thickened around them, probing at the edges of their shield and causing it to fade, as Shaper's curiosity dipped into dark fascination.
You have your prize. Or are you so quick to break your word?
Midnight snapped, reinforcing the shield around them.
No, we would not. We are merely curious.
The shadows stopped, then pulled away. The walls appeared to bow inwards before disappearing in the swirling shadows, all light outside of their shield swallowed up, but for the dull red of his eyes frozen behind the crystal prison.
Truly, a gift fit for a king.
The hairs on the nape of Twilight's neck tingled. She did not see any magic aura, but she could feel Shaper's power slithering through the air, like invisible serpents. The strange current slid past her, wrapping around Princess Luna and squeezing firm. Twilight stepped away, watching in silence. The shadow shuddered around the shield as Luna's serene expression strained, her brow furrowing and her lips turning down into a pained frown. She let out quiet grunts as her hooves scratched at the ground, tail swishing and wings twitching.
What are you doing?
Twilight asked, trying to keep the weariness out of her voice. If Shaper was trying to hurt Luna, then they would have to defeat him next.
Only what you bid us do, equestrian,
Shaper rumbled. There was a hungry energy in his voice, like an alcoholic in line on the first day of cider season.
The process is not pleasant, but your princess will not be harmed.
Twilight pursed her lips. Midnight gave her hoof a gentle squeeze.
Steady, little flower. I can see the workings of his magic. He's doing as we asked.
Finally, Luna relaxed. Twilight felt the invisible dark presence withdraw, retreating back to Shaper's crystal form as the shadows eased back.
It is done.
Twilight licked her lips. Gingerly, she knelt at Princess Luna's side, uncertain of whether to reach out or even to speak. But finally, she couldn't keep it in any longer. She touched a hoof to Luna's shoulder, her heart skipping a beat when the alicorn stirred.
Princess?